I took this skull and put it around this cucumber so I could see if I could grow a cucumber-shaped skull. And just in case it didn't work, I also took this shell and put it over this cucumber to see if we could grow a cucumber-shaped shell. We needed options to make sure we got this right. And if we did get it right, it would only take 5 weeks for it to grow. But let me backtrack a bit because you're probably wondering how I even ended up with these cucumbers. I took some seeds, placed them on a damp piece of paper towel, and in 1 week they grew little tails. 2 more weeks passed and the tails grew bigger, and that's when I planted them in soil, repotted them when they got big enough, and the magic began to happen. Weeks started to pass me by and the cucumber started to morph and grow before my very eyes. When I saw this bee dancing in the cucumber flower, which by the way is edible and very tasty, the flower, not the bee, I knew that nature was on my side and our cucumbers were gonna start to get big. But that's also when I realized that I didn't want to just grow regular cucumbers. I wanted to experiment with them and see if I could grow them into weird shapes. And that's when the skull and the shell came into play. So I started with the skull. Every week I would check on it, and it seemed like it was doing well at first and growing more thick by the day. But then I soon noticed that we might have a problem, because after 4 weeks passed and the cucumber wasn't growing so much, I got nervous our experiment was gonna fail. And we had a squirrel problem and they kept coming and trying to eat my cucumber in the skull. So I went into combat with the squirrels and decided to put a protective barrier around the skull so it wouldn't get eaten, and that worked really well. I was really excited to be back on track with the cucumber skull. I waited 3 more weeks and I noticed the cucumber looked like it was starting to turn yellow, and that's always a sign to pick them before they go bad, so I knew I had to harvest it right away. I decided it was finally time to take the cucumber out of the skull to see what we were working with. It was really hard to take it out, and all that effort also ended up with such disappointment because the cucumber didn't grow into a shell. And in that moment, I was so glad that I gave us options and also added the shell into this experiment, because this shell was our only hope in turning our cucumbers into a cool shape. So of course, I had put the shell shape over the cucumber and I secured it to a wooden pole with string. It kind of ended up looking like Patrick from SpongeBob, but this is where the waiting game began to see what would happen to our cuke. Weeks started to pass me by and the cucumber looked like it was changing a bit. After a few weeks, I pressed into the sides of the shell to see if the cucumber was getting thicker and morphing into the shape of the shell, and it seemed like it was bigger, but it was still quite hollow. So I left it to continue growing for another week. But I noticed that either a squirrel or a tiny critter was competing with us, because there was a tiny little bug or wormhole, and there was also a small little yellow spot on the cucumber. So I knew that we had to pick it sooner rather than later, and I made the executive decision that it was indeed time to see what our cucumber turned into. I cut the stem of the cucumber, took it into my hands, and the moment of truth finally came to reveal what was hiding underneath this shell, oyster, scallop, Patrick from SpongeBob shape. Slowly, I started to remove the shape off of the cucumber to reveal the final result. It felt sort of like a fail, but also a huge win because the cucumber looked like we tie-dyed it. And in that moment, I was imagining putting a thick string around future cucumbers so that we could grow cucumber stripes. That would be so awesome, and maybe we will in the future. But listen, I know we didn't grow a shell, but we tie-dyed a cucumber instead. I think the problem was that the cucumbers might have been too big already when I put the shapes on. I guess it's really up in the air as to where we went wrong, so let me know what you think. But in the bad, there is always good, because we still ended up with a really interesting tie-dyed cucumber, and this experiment wasn't over yet. Trust the process, okay? Because I decided to cut it open, and at this point I had one idea. I sliced the cucumber down the middle and opened it up to reveal some nice seeds that were definitely growable, and I got excited because the grocery store cucumbers don't have seeds. So I now had my own tie-dyed cucumber seeds that I took, placed straight in some soil, and grew into a little plant. And I'm gonna tell you what I turned the cucumbers into that grew from this tiny plant, but first, while that grew, I knew I needed to find something out for myself. So I took a plane to the Middle East, hopped in a car, drove through the desert, did some cartwheels in the desert, saw some wild camels along the way, probably one of the top 5 moments of my life, and then finally I arrived at my final destination, hopped on the ATV and drove straight into the cucumber fields. It was so exciting to see how cucumbers grow commercially, all the way from a tiny baby cucumber to an adult cucumber, and then into the packaging facility to be processed to sell to all of us in the grocery stores. And let me tell you, I was like a kid in a candy shop seeing how cucumbers grow on a large scale. The greenhouses were temperature controlled, so it was so hot inside of them, but I continued to hop on and off of that ATV to visit the different stages of life of cucumbers. It was absolutely awesome. I even got to pick whatever I wanted and eat them right on the spot, and they tasted so damn good. You could see that the adult cucumber plants had leaves that started to get really brown, and that was cool. But before I left, I also visited the packaging facility where I saw firsthand how cucumbers and even flowers and peppers are packaged to sell. There were literally hundreds of cucumbers and peppers, and what happens is they pick them and then they keep them in containers like this. And once they're ready for packaging, of course, you gotta eat some of them first, but then they get placed on this white little plate and then they get weighed so that they can be priced accordingly. And finally, they get placed onto the conveyor belt and wrapped in plastic to get shipped off to the grocery stores to sell. I guess they use this tractor to transport them to the nearest facility once they're packaged and ready to go, and I obviously had some fun on that tractor, okay? I can't leave this place without sitting on it and pretending to drive. But anywho, it was so cool to be able to witness this amazing process. And after my journey here was done, I flew back home and I knew I needed to go back to my one cucumber that I grew to see how it was doing and to get to the final step of my experiment. So I flew back home and saw that my cucumber ended up growing into this. I picked them from the garden, very exciting moment, and this is what spending $1,000 on your garden looks like during the harvest. Well worth it if you know what I mean. But then I took the cukes, cut them up, and made a beautiful recipe that I got from Logan on TikTok. Thanks Logan, if you know, you know. I added peanut butter, soy sauce, spicy chili, red wine vinegar, and garlic, shook it up, and was left with this amazing recipe that tasted so good, especially knowing that I grew the cukes all by myself at home. So, this was quite the journey, and I guess the moral of the story is that next year you can bet on the fact that we are gonna grow our own cucumbers into shapes and learn from our mistakes to get it right next time.
I'm like a kid in a candy shop right now.